Hello and welcome to Mojo News. I'm Selby Stewart. Many of you may be aware of Antifa, an anti-fascist group that occupy the far left of the political spectrum. The group is known for a strong anti-capitalist stance and extreme protest tactics. One of Antifa Australia's most controversial former members joins us here today. Shayne Hunter, thanks for joining us.
It's good to be here.
How are you going?
I'm going well, how are you?
Yeah, I'm good, thank you. So before we get to when you leave the group, can you explain a bit about what Antifa Australia is?
Yeah, Antifa Australia is a subset of the anarchist and communist movements that try to go after what they think are far right-wing forces in society and try and shut them down, so stop them from being able to publicly speak and organise meetings privately and organise on social media. So they're trying to disrupt that as much as possible. The only problem is that they subjectively define what's fascist.
How do they try and shut those down?
So the famous ones were the Reclaim Australia rallies. There were counter rallies with the idea of trying to, one, have a bigger presence to show that, you know, their views were more marginal than our views, as well as hopefully have enough numbers to be able to push through the police and I guess punish them physically by, you know, assaulting them or whatever.
So how did you get from being a 15-year-old kid growing up in Brisbane, playing video games, to Antifa?
Well, it's funny you mentioned video games, because Antifa is like role-playing a video game. I like to think of it as a form of unconscious cosplay, because you get seduced into this grand narrative that you think your actions are so important, that you're going to save humanity from the oppressive structures of capitalism and the patriarchy and the rising racism and the far right. But how did I get there? Well, I was worried about a Western intervention in Syria, and it encouraged me to go out to these rallies. And that's when I started to meet these radical left-wingers, because in my peer group, there wasn't many people interested in talking about this kind of stuff, but these radical leftists who, a lot of them were affiliated with Sydney Uni, were interested in having these discussions. So it made me feel, I guess it was a bit of a cathartic release to be able to talk to people my own age about that. And then over the process of maybe 6 months, I slowly went from, I guess, a more authentic version of myself to slowly wearing all black and then starting to think and speak in ideological terms.
So within the organisation, I mean, it often appears quite decentralised. Is there a chain of command?
They're decentralised in the same way that North Korea is a People's Democratic Republic. You know, they play all this lip service to like, oh, we're against hierarchy, we believe in democratic organising or whatever. But, you know, underneath that, what's really going on is it's just like a high school dynamic. So you've got like your cool kids at the top or whatever, and then it sort of trickles down.
I know the group's quite steadfast since you've left that you never had any sort of leadership position or pivotal role. What was your role within Antifa?
I was involved with maybe 2 other people of setting up Antifa Sydney, which was sort of a collective of these anarchists who were interested in doing this Antifa stuff. And yeah, I was involved in setting up the WordPress, which would comment on people who were believed to be right-wing activists. Some of the information isn't, you know, it's just slander, really. Some of it is accurate. And then, yeah, obviously the social media presence, but also organising some of the first protests against the far right that happened in Sydney. So there was like a protest outside of Marrickville and Tempe, and 2 right-wing groups on the same day. So one was protesting halal food at Coles or whatever, and we rocked up there and we were doing what's called a black bloc, where everyone dresses in black and they wear masks, and they'll say that their reason for wearing masks is to protect their identity from being doxxed or by the fascists, but in actuality it's to be able to commit crimes and get away with it by not being identified. And so yeah, this black bloc kind of crowded around these far right-wing activists and managed to sort of, there was a physical confrontation with some of the activists and stuff, and then they ended up leaving, and then that black bloc of maybe 30 people marched on down to the Tempe headquarters and then started picketing outside. So I was involved in organising that.
So what were you actually told to do if you encountered law enforcement or counter-protesters?
What were we told to do?
Yeah, we'll say on the ground, you're at a rally and you encounter law enforcement or a counter-protest. What were you doing?
Well, we would try to, whenever possible, we would try to outmaneuver the police to get at the far right. And but then people would also be mindful that not everyone would be on board for getting arrested. So usually in these kind of activist circles, you would have what's called your arrestables and your non-arrestables. So people who usually haven't had any kind of criminal record, who won't face such harsh penalties if they get a criminal record, might volunteer themselves to be arrestable. So they'll maybe do activities that are less legal or more risky in these situations. And then you've obviously got your non-arrestables who try to back up. They're the backup dancers too. They try and support logistically. So
what was the moment that you actually decided to leave?
Basically, I would question the validity of judging someone by their group identity. So not all white men are automatically, like there's a huge difference between white men in that group. And so I did a video questioning the validity in that and suggesting a more nuanced view that, you know, not all white men have some unearned privilege and a lot of them could have had very hard lives, and that's worth acknowledging. And this was stuff that people would privately agree with me in this anarchist activist subculture. People would privately agree with me, and they would also talk about how people could get involved in like very petty disputes using this kind of language. And that was kind of like the last straw. I'd seen like a lot of crazy stuff up to this point and a lot of like puritanical denouncement of people and like people being like socially shamed and sort of shunned and punished for these really minor, you know, kind of thought crimes or politically incorrect infractions.
It's interesting, so because you've referred to it before as a collective psychosis or pathological political tribalism.
Yes.
But it seems now you're saying that there are people within the group who disagree with the group as well.
This is the amazing thing about, I guess, group dynamics or whatever. It's like these people, their identity is so hinged upon what the group thinks of them and their group membership that comes before their own logic or sanity, or because it's like they've slowly, in order to gain group membership, they've had to give up the right of independent thinking and the ability to be honest. Like they've kind of traded that for group membership, so that they're first and foremost loyal to the group and loyal to the cause and not individuals.
What do you fear would happen if a group like Antifa or extreme politics took over in Australia?
Oh, we'd all die. It'd be like, it would be starvation. I think what would happen is they can't distinguish between, say, the degree of meritocracy and institutions in society that may have elements of oppression and corruption, but they can't distinguish that with the good elements of any of those institutions. So they would want to rip them all down in the name of, like, you know, fighting against all the oppressive or corrupt elements.
Sure. Here are a few incidents in Australia involving Antifa recently. So they mobilised about 100 supporters within an hour to shout down a speaking event involving Milo Yiannopoulos. They attacked Andrew Bolt with shaving cream and glitter, and they clashed at a halal food festival in Ascot Vale. I mean, to the average person, they might not see that as the actions of a dangerous group. Why do you think it is so dangerous?
Why do I think it's dangerous? It's because they think they have the right to decide who and who doesn't get to speak. Andrew Bolt is like an avatar for tens of thousands of people in Australia, whether you agree with him or not. But when you decide that you can use violence against him, you're basically saying that those tens of thousands of people that think like Andrew Bolt, they all should be punched and beaten into shutting up. So they're not allowed to even voice their opinion because their opinion is wrong and our opinion is right. So that's a totalitarian mindset right there. That's how you get North Korea. That's how you get all that mad shit. You know, that's why I think it's dangerous. And the centre left, the people at Media Watch or whatever, don't seem to understand how dangerous the far left is. Well, I feel like the centre right understand Nazis are dangerous.
A lot of your criticism is levelled at the extreme left. Why don't you criticise the extreme right to the same degree?
Well, I feel like in a lot of the videos I've made, I've consistently drawn parallels between the far left and the far right. And, you know, I've talked about how seductive it is to say blame the Jews, and how structurally there's a very similar element to that in terms of the same way people would blame the patriarchy. You know, these sort of amorphous systems or whatever. So I feel that I have done a lot to criticise the far right. And I also feel like, you know, at universities across Australia, there's a lot of radical leftist thinking and groups involved in campuses, while I don't see very many like far right-wing groups involved in campuses.
Just to put a flag there, when you put quotation marks over things like patriarchy and race, when you did it earlier over racism, is that because you think they're invalid, or?
Well, I feel like it's not the whole story. I feel like when these radical leftists talk about, you know, they'll often go, oh, Australia's a... Well, first of all, they'll redefine what constitutes racism. So, for example, I don't know if you've heard of this term, but microaggressions. So the classical example of a microaggression will be a white person saying to a black person, where are you from? Oh, Sydney. Oh, where are you really from? And that automatically to them is an example of the person in the white group exerting their power and entitlement over the person in the oppressor group. So someone go, I know where you're really from, could actually be interested in they're not enacting some sort of power struggle between groups of oppressor and oppressed. So when I do quotation marks, what I'm doing is when they use these terms like racism and sexism, they've got a very different definition to the mainstream definition. But I feel like when a child, you know, starts crying or screams for attention, the parent turns around and pays attention. And I feel what these radical leftists do is when they use terms like racism and sexism, they're doing it because they know that these terms have social weight.
Okay, so Monash University released a video that I know you saw. It was titled Change It, and it had a series of clips at protests and rallies. And the opening clip shows Richard Spencer, who's characterised in America as a white supremacist, being punched in the face. What were your thoughts on that video?
Well, my first impulse was I remembered some of the people in that Antifa group who were like young people who were quite intelligent, but they became a radical left-winger through being exposed to some of the stuff in their uni courses. They've kind of dropped out of society because their belief is society is just this oppressive, corrupt institution. So why would you ever want to be part of that? And then the second thought I thought was like the promotion of violence. I think, you know, I don't think that's the way to deal with radical extremist groups, is to promote like vigilantism, showing it's okay to break the law as long as you're doing it against people who you think have the wrong opinions. And yeah, and glorifying violence and stuff. I thought it was atrocious and unbelievable that a university would pump that out. It's crazy.
Well, I mean, in your opinion, how do we facilitate healthy political debate among students?
So they kind of have an anti-debate mindset. And the way I think you facilitate that is, I don't know, you try to put on events, you don't back down when they try and censor debate. I mean, in the University of Sydney, there were some conservatives who put on an event, I think that was about the dangers of socialism, and the socialist groups and the student unions that were involved in that protested that, and essentially these conservative groups had to pay for the security fee. So the radical leftists had the heckler's veto, but if there's no conservative groups or whatever protesting radical leftist groups. So I think, yeah, trying to facilitate debate and not letting it be shut down by radical leftists is a good start to facilitate that and maybe deal with that problem.
Thank you again, Shayne, for joining us.
Thanks, man.
That was Shayne Hunter, former member of Antifa Australia. Don't forget to head over to mojonews.com.au to check out some of the award-winning journalism coming out of Monash University. Thank you.